So I just finished a meal and I went to go put some dishes in the dishwasher, and then when I came back it was this Amazon Fire Stick screensaver that kind of inspired this video. A few of you know I've been diving into the world of PCG and I thought this would be a great scene to test that on. I just kind of want a super leafy forest with some trees around and then we can see what we can make. The aim is to get it as photorealistic looking as I can. I'll show you in detail all the important steps and then do an overview of some of the simplest stuff. These procedural environments are just so fun to make. I can't wait to do more of this. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so first let's enable the PCG plugin. Type in PCG. We just want this first one, procedural content generation framework. By the way, I'm in a fresh level. You can just right click, level, and then save it as whatever you want. I'm also in Unreal Engine 5.4.4. First, let's use the environment light mixer to make our base atmosphere and light setup. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we can just click all of them on. The next thing I'll do is go to my directional light and change the lux from 10 to 120,000. The reason I'm using this value is because I'm trying to do this physically based lighting method that I learned about in this amazing lighting video on Visual Tech Arts channel. So don't worry too much. It's not a huge thing. And the next thing we're going to do is just disable ray traced shadows on our sun and our skylight. And that is because we will be using nanite foliage. Next thing we'll do is make a post process volume. So the plus menu, I'm just going to type in post process, drag that in. And then let me just do some of my favorite settings. So I'm going to make it unbound. These are just part of my favorites, by the way. I'm going to change exposure from 1 to 0, and then min EV and max EV will be 14 and 14. And this will be part of our physically based lighting setup. For bloom, I'm going to just change it from standard to convolution. And then for the lens flare, I'm just going to reduce it down to 0.1. And then I'm just going to go into the lumen settings and then just up my lumen, scene lighting quality, scene detail, final gather quality. And then also just make sure my reflections are on hit lighting cache and also the quality slider for that. Max reflection bounces, I'm just going to put to 3. And I think that's all we need for this. Next, let's go to our landscape mode, which is Shift 2 as the shortcut. And then I'm just going to use the default settings and hit create. I'm going to go back to my selection mode by pressing Shift 1. Again, this menu here. For our landscape material, just go into your Quixel Ridge. I'm going to be using this dry fallen leaves material. Just type in dry fallen leaves surface and it should be this guy right here. I want to make sure that our landscape base has this sort of darker, mulchy, dead leafy look, because when we scatter in our 3D fallen leaves, it'll blend really nicely between each other and give that sense of layering and complexity in the landscape forest bed. The next thing you do, select your landscape, scroll down to landscape material, and I'm just going to drag in the Quixel material that we downloaded. In terms of any changes I made to the material instance, all I did was change the normal strength to 3. For now, we don't need to worry about the tiling because once we scatter our PCG leaves onto this landscape, we're not going to notice it. The next thing we'll do is just set up a quick camera and mannequin. So I've just got this mannequin I've got from Cinema 4D. I'm going to zero out the X and Y. And then I'm also going to go to the plus menu, cinematic, and then cine camera actor and drag that in, drag it up to around eye level, maybe somewhere there. By the way, if you don't have this 2-pane view setup, all you got to do is go to this top left 3 lines menu, go to layouts, and then select 2 panes. Now, just so we stay organized, the next thing I'll do is in the outliner, let's make 3 folders. So I'll call it 01 lighting, and then new folder 02 cameras, and then new folder 03. Actually, we don't need a number for this one. We'll just call it foliage. Just going to drag my camera into cameras, all of these guys into my lighting, and I'm also going to rename my camera cam 01. Cool. So your outliner should just look like this, and now we are ready for some PCG. Just a friendly like and subscribe reminder. So for our PCG leaf scattering asset, just go to your Quixel Bridge and find the dead leaves asset. If you just type in dead leaves 3D, just pick this guy on the left, not the sharper shaped one on the right. Should be the more rounded one. And you can also find a lot of other really good scattering assets in this natural scatter debris section right here. You can see I've also downloaded some sticks and twigs that we will be using later on. So these are the 3 assets that come with that download, and we will scatter them in PCG. And if you just go to the material instance and make sure it's not the billboard one, just the regular material instance, these are the changes I've made to the albedo and the roughness. So I've kind of just given them more of a reddish orangey pink tint, and I've also upped the contrast a bit more, and I've made them less rough so they have a bit more of a specular highlight when the sun hits them. And if I'm just in unlit mode so you can see what's going on, but this is what they look like with lighting, so a lot more autumn color palettes, but it still retains that yellow variation that we like. All right, let's make our first PCG graph. So in your content browser, just make a PCG folder or something, right click, go to PCG graph, and I'm just going to call this PCG tutorial leaves, and then we just want to drag it into our scene. And for now, I think this will be a good size. I'm just going to make sure it's not too far behind my camera because that doesn't really matter. Actually, I think I'm going to make it 50 and 50 just because we will be putting trees in, so we want to get an idea of the density. So 50 and 50 should be good. Let's open up our PCG graph. So just double click. I'm going to make it full screen, and let's first sample some points on our landscape. So right click, get landscape data. Out of that, type in surface sampler, and if I press D to debug, you will now notice we are sampling points on our scene. I'm just going to adjust the settings. So I'm going to do 8 in the points per square meter. Point extents will be 555. It's much smaller. If there's a better way to do this, please let me know, PCG experts, in the comments, but this is kind of a good density I found to get the leaves to feel really dense on the forest floor. To randomize the rotation a bit, just drag out of your surface sampler into a transform points, and this is where we can add some random rotation. So I'm going to do 360. I'm also going to randomize the offset off the ground so it looks like it's a little uneven to 0.5 and 2. So 0.5 centimeter to 2 centimeters above the ground, just so it's not fully merged into our landscape, and then again acting as a layer above all the dead leaves and mud underneath. And for scale, I'm going to make the minimum scale 0.4 and the maximum scale 0.7. I'm just going to select these guys, press Q to straighten the node wire, and just drag it out a little more. And then out of the transform points, static mesh spawner, and this is where we will put in our Quixel assets. So on the right, just click the plus button 3 times, and I'm going to also stop debugging the surface sampler. If I debug the transform points, you'll see now they all have random rotation and a bit of variation in scale, as well as some variation in height from the ground. So go back to our static mesh spawner, stop debugging on the transform points, and then just twirl down these guys and then input the 3 different meshes. So 1, 2, 3. And you can now see we have this really detailed forest floor, and it was super simple. I'm just going to rotate our sun around a little more just so we have a bit more backlighting and some specular highlights on the leaves. I'm just going to duplicate our cam 1 to make a cam 2 and just pilot it in this scene here. And I'm just going to move around a bit to get a nice look at the ground plane. Cool. So now we have this very detailed floor without any effort, and let's jump into our tree scatter. If you're interested in learning more things like this and this, as well as cool movie recommendations like this, I've got a link to my newsletter below. I send it once a week. I don't spam you, and it's only cool stuff. Okay, so for the trees, if you go to the Epic Games Marketplace and just find the Megascans Trees European Black Alder, just add that to a project. You need to add it to a 5.3 project because for some reason they have not updated it to 5.4, even though it works fine. So once you've done that, you will have this asset zoo level. If I just full screen it, and I use the pivot painter ones just because I like their animations more. They look a bit more realistic. The assets that I used, if I just search for it, is forest 01, 02, and 03. And then I also used field 02. Just these 4 trees, right click, and then migrate them to your current project. You should then have this folder, which is geometry, Black Alder Geometry Pivot Painter. If you right click all of them, I've also enabled nanite on all those guys, which is why we disabled ray trace shadows, because they are super buggy and don't work that well. And for the materials, all I've done is adjusted the roughness in the branches and the leaves, and I've also just I've also lowered the brightness just a tad to 0.8, and I've done that on both the field and the forest leaf material. Okay, cool. So for the trees, just right click, PCG, new PCG graph. I'm going to call it PCG_trees. Then we can just drag it into our scene. And what I'm going to do is go to our leaf PCG volume, shift right click the transform tab, go to our trees PCG volume and shift left click, and that'll copy the transform values of our leaves volume. So that way you don't need to manually drag it and resize it. I might make the trees a little bigger just because trees are bigger the assets. So I might make it 75 and 75 just so it extends a bit more. Okay, so let's open up our tree PCG graph. It's going to be the exact same logic. So get landscape data, sample, surface sampler to get some points. I'm just going to press debug, and we don't need this many. So I'm just going to change the sampler settings to 0.01. So this is where our trees will be scattered around our forest. You can up this if you want to, totally up to you. Again, I'm pressing D to debug. To have some more control over our points, I'm going to drag out of this into a density filter, and this will let us fine tune our points. So you can see here, right now we're culling out half of our points. So if I go back to 0, you can see all the lower bound or the darker values are being culled out. And if I drag the upper bound or the lighter values will be getting culled out. You can play around with this. I'm just going to leave it maybe on just 0.1, just cull out a few of them, and I'm pretty happy with that density. And then again, the same thing as last time, drag out of the density filter to a transform points. Let's add some random rotation, and then also maybe 3 and 3 in the X and Y rotation. I'm going to set the minimum offset in the Z to -3 minimum and then -1 maximum. And then I'm also just going to make the max size 1.2 and then hit save. I'm just going to stop debugging, and then let's make a static mesh spawner. I'm not going to connect it yet. Make 4 mesh entries. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now we can hook up the static mesh spawner. And now you can see we have some trees. And what you can do is play with the seed. So what we can do is play with our surface sampler seed. So I'll just go 1, 2, 3, 4, right from here. We've got a good amount of thick trees, but a good amount of tall ones as well. Okay, so I'm happy with this tree setup. Now let's set up a blocking volume so we can tell our PCG graph not to spawn trees in this certain area. So I'm just going to minimize the graph, zoom out a bit. I'm also going to just clean up the outliner a little bit and just drag our dead leaves, little asset zoo here into our foliage folder, and then just hide it. Okay, so for the blocking volume, I'm just going to go up to the plus menu, go down to volumes, and then find blocking, and then drag it into the scene. You can see it's quite small. I'm just going to scale it up to maybe a 20, which might be okay. I'm going to also just change brush shape if you scroll down in the details panel from box to cylinder. And then what I'm going to do is just scale it on the X and the Y, maybe somewhere there around where our mannequin is. And then what you can do is just select your blocking volume and just type in tag. And then we're just going to add an actor tag. So hit the plus button, and then I'm going to type in PCG_block, and then hit enter. And I'm just going to open up our PCG graph again, and then I'm going to do difference, and we'll get a difference node. And I'm just going to select the landscape data for the source, and then I'm going to do get actor data. And then on the right, I'm going to do all world actors, and then actor selection by tag. And I'm just going to type in PCG_block, make sure it's the exact same name, and then drag that into difference, and then the out can go into the bounding shape. So now if we drag our blocking volume around, trees will not spawn in that area. Now you might have noticed when I did that, it spawned trees around the entire landscape. What we can do is I'm just going to disable the static mesh spawner by pressing E, and that, as you can see, is the enable toggle on toggle off. And I'm just going to debug this difference point. And as you can see, it's doing the difference between the landscape data and our PCG block volume. Now technically this isn't wrong because it's grabbing our entire landscape and then getting the difference, but really what I want is the difference of this PCG volume. So what I'll do is if we select our PCG trees, type in tag, and then we can just type in an actor tag and do the same thing. So PCG_trees, and then hit enter. And then I'm just going to do get actor data, sorry, and then change the filter to all world actors by tag, call it PCG_trees. And then what I can do is disconnect this by pressing Alt and clicking, and then drag this guy in there. And now we have the difference between our volume and our PCG block. And then what we can do is disconnect that, press E to enable that, and now we have it working correctly. Now, what if you want multiple blocking volumes? So if I press Alt and drag it, you'll see it's not working. All you need to do is go back to your PCG block actor data, select multiple. I don't know why I said that so weird. Select multiple, and now you can have multiple blocking regions. I'm also just going to up my tree density a little bit. So maybe 0.02. So now we have a really dense forest. And then what I'll do is up the density filter a little bit. So maybe 0.4, 0.5, something like that. We can also now play around with our sun rotation, get something that we're happy with. I'm also just going to change my main wide camera lens to a 50. And I'm also going to track my figure for the depth of field focus. Okay, now let's add some more complexity to the base of these trees so it doesn't look so bare in the landscape ground. All right, so let's get some big branches and some rocks and roots to form around the base of our tree points. So to do that, just open up your tree graph and let's make a new surface sampler because this one is super spread out and I kind of want more points to play around with for these other assets. So out of our landscape data surface sampler, I'm gonna make the points at 1 and then point extends 555 and then hit debug. I might try 2. Yeah, so 2 and then 555. And then out of that, I'm gonna get a distance node. And then for the target, what I want to do is use our tree points as our target. But we're going to have a few of these layered up. So to keep this graph clean, I'm going to drag out of our density filter, our tree density filter, into a named reroute. And then I'm just going to call it, oh my, I just double clicked it. I'm going to press F2 to rename it and call it tree points. And I'm also going to close Visual Studio. And now that we have this, what we can do is right click in the named reroutes, just get our tree points and then plug it into our target. So now we don't need to draw this line here and then all the other ones beneath it. So if I debug our distance points, you'll see it doesn't really look like anything's changed. And if I just reduce this to maybe 50, still nothing changes. And the reason is because we need to select set density. So if we select that, now you can see if I go to Alt 3, any points around our tree stumps will be darker values and they'll move out to lighter values. So if I increase this distance to 150, you can see that transition becomes smoother. Now that we have this really nice set of data, we can drag out of our distance and then get a density filter. And you remember this will cull out points based on light and dark values. So if I stop debugging this and debug this guy, you can see all the darker values are being culled out as I reduce this. And if I increase it, it gets more scarce around the tree. So we just want to invert this filter. And now what we have is exactly what we want. So the higher this filter, the more spread we have. So I reckon I'll leave it at around 0.38. And I actually think there's a lot of maybe too many points here. Like if you imagine a branch at each of these points, that might be a little too much. So what I'm going to do is drag out of our original surface sampler, then fill, alt click to delete that node, and then drag this one in. And now you can see I can have control over the overall amount of points. So maybe 0.6 or 0.5 is good. Now this is pretty much the basic logic to have all that done. So now we just do exactly what we did before. So drag out of this guy, get a transform points, and then debug this one. If you want to turn off the debug on another node and only do it for the selected node, just press Control Alt D and that'll change that. You can also see that here in the right click menu. So Control Alt D, and then I'm going to randomize the rotation. I'm also going to randomize the X and Y rotation a bit more. I'm going to make the min and max scale 1 and 3, and I'm also going to make the offset min -5 or maybe -2. Now if we do have some rocks and roots here, it might look a little weird if there's a really big one out here and then a small one here. Maybe not, you can try it out. But say we want the points to get smaller as they move outwards from the tree, what we can do is between our distance and density filter, I've just opened it up again, dude. How is this happening? Okay. Between our distance and density filter, we can get this node called execute blueprint. And then in the drop down, just type in scale and then have a scale by density. And then what this does is if I debug this guy and plug in this node, what we can do is set the scale min to 0 and max to 1. And you'll notice it is scaling our points smaller as they get closer to the tree. We want the opposite of that. So really what we should be doing is actually connecting it after our density filter. And because our filter was inverted, we also want to invert the min and max. So I'm just going to put my max to 0 and my minimum to 1. And that'll now, as you can see, if I up my density filter to like 0.95, you can see as the values get brighter, they also get smaller. And as they get darker, they get bigger. And then we can just alt click that, drag that into transform points. And now we have a little bit more randomness, but you can see the ones closer to the stumps are bigger and outer are smaller. And maybe I can reduce this to like a 2, and that gives us a nice variation. And I'll also, again, maybe lower this to like a 0.8 or a 0.5, just to not have too many scattered objects. And this is where we get our static mesh spawner. So static mesh spawner, and let's plug in some Quixel assets. So I'm just going to be using these 3 assets for the big branches. So large fallen tree, and the old tree branch that you can just get from the Quixel bridge. Make 3 mesh entries, plug in all your meshes, and then connect up the static mesh spawner. Okay, so these are way too many and huge. So let's go back to our PCG graph, maybe change it from 1 to 2 to like 0.3 to 1. And then let's also reduce the amount of points, maybe 0.1, and then reduce the size even more, maybe 0.1 to 0.5. There we go. And there's still too many, I would say. So what we can do is leave this on 0.5, the first density filter, and then go to our first one, and then just let's get rid of more. So maybe 0.7, 0.8, something like that could work a little better. And I'm also just going to randomize the placement a bit. So maybe in the X and Y, I'll do 50 and 150. So then they'll be kind of spread out depending on where they've fallen from, even 150 for this as well. And then also add it in the minus, and again, reduce the size a little bit, 0.1 and 0.3. So that should be good. But now we've got some leaves, some branches fallen underneath our trees. And then again, you can always adjust either this density filter or this density filter to change the amount that you want. And you can also change the distance. Like say I wanted it out further, just do 500. And now they are out way further, as you can see here. And then if I reduce it back 150, they go much closer. Okay, I'm just going to repeat this process for the rocks and then come back. Just going to select all of these nodes here, press Ctrl D, and then hook up the surface sampler. I'm also going to check recompute seed on the transform node. I'm also going to reset the scale on the transform, and then also change my offset min and max. I'm going to be using this Nordic Forest rock cluster, and I've just adjusted the material to have a slight orange tint, as well as reduce the saturation and brightness. Now you can see if I enable this, we now have some rocks spawning near our trees, just to kind of cover up the base of where it's landing into the forest. I know it's not the most realistic, but visually it helps a lot. And I'm now going to add some tree roots as well. For the tree roots, I'll be using these mossy forest roots, and I've just kind of given them slightly different colors, just so they add a bit more variation under the leaves. Again, it's the exact same setup, so I'm just going to duplicate this and then adjust the density filter and the transform points and see what looks good. And now you can see if I enable our tree roots, it does add a lot more variation and randomness to our tree base. I'm just going to edit the material of that brighter one just so it fits in with our scene a bit more. So maybe 0.5 or 0.4 in the brightness. And then I'm also going to adjust the maximum transform to like a -3, -5 maybe, just so it's embedded in the leaves a lot better. And I'm also going to change the scale min to like a 0.5. And there we go. Now we have a bit more of a natural looking tree root scatter. And if I just bring this up a bit, 0.6, there we go. So now we have some rocks, some tree roots, and the last thing I'm going to add around the trees is just some ground cover plants. And before I quickly duplicate this setup again, I'm also just going to organize this a bit more. So I'm going to call this first setup trees, press C to comment, and then the second setup, press C. I'm going to call this big branches, and then the second setup will be rocks, and then the third will be roots. I'm going to be using these common hemp models from the Quixel bridge for the ground cover around the trees. And now you can see if I enable the ground cover, I've got a lot of nice foliage kind of coming out of those tree areas and also scaling down as they get further out. And the changes I made was to the distance node. I made the distance larger. I've also reduced the density filter down to 0 here, so I'm just getting all the points I want. In this density filter, I've upped it to 0.9 again to get more plants. Scale by density I've left the same, and then transform points, again just basic settings, change the offset min and max, and then also the scale min and max. I probably will maybe reduce the maximum to like a 1.2 and then a 0.3 0.35. And if I just go closer up, now we have like a nice natural scatter coming out of the tree areas. As for the material, if I just jump into it real quick, all I've done is added a bit of a color overlay. So you can see here just to darken it a bit so it's not so bright. And then I've also changed the roughness intensity to 0.3 just to get better specular highlights from the sun at glancing angles like this. Okay, so that's the basic setup for the trees. Let's now add some more complexity to our ground plane with all the forest leaves. Okay, so for the ground plane, I have these assets from the Quixel Bridge, the wood sorrel. I want these to be grouped and spread out in clumps, and this is something I did in my previous PCG tutorial for the cinematic foggy environment. This just gives a bit more of a natural looking scatter, and it just looks more realistic. So this is the only kind of complex thing I did, even though it's not at all, and let's jump in. The only material change I made was I used a color overlay, as you can see here, just to make them not so bright, and then I've changed the roughness intensity to 0.2. So in your leaves PCG graph, just drag out of the surface sampler, and we're going to look for a spatial noise. And I'm just going to debug this. So it doesn't really look like a noise pattern, but if I just adjust the contrast to something like 3 and then change the transform offset to 50, 50, 50, you can now see we have a noise pattern that will be used to scatter our ground cover. So as we all know, if I just stop debugging this, we can filter out these points with a density filter. And then if I debug the density filter, you can see it's now getting rid of a bunch of our darker values. So I might do it a little more, maybe 0.8. So let's see how this looks. I'm going to stop debugging, and then we can get an execute blueprint. We'll use the same setup as before, which is scale by density, which is this guy. And then I'm just going to set the scale max to 1. Let me first debug what he looks like. And then I'm going to change the exponent to something like 5, just to add a bit more contrast. And as you can see, yeah, now we have cool patterns of density scaling within our clumps. From there, it's the exact same setup as we've always been doing. So transform points and then a static mesh spawner. With the leaves graph, because we have so many points that we are sampling, it will bog down your scene a bit more. So just keep that in mind. If you don't want it to be too laggy in the editor, you can just disable the leaves, and that'll make your graph a lot smoother when adding mesh entries. So now if I enable my static mesh spawner, you can see these cloves now break up the forest floor really nicely, and they have these nice clumps with varying size that sort of blend between each other. And then it also works great with the leaves in conjunction. So now we can group this, call it ground cover 01. And then what I'll do is duplicate these guys here to scatter some other assets across our entire forest floor. Also, I think I just want a little more trees in this area. So I'm just going to change the density filter to maybe a 0.4. And then I'm also going to change the seed. You can now see something like this looks a lot more convincing, and you have the combination of all the different things we've been scattering. I'm just going to duplicate this setup here from our PCG leaves of the ground cover. Then I'm going to just delete this scale by density, plug him right into transform points. And I'm just going to duplicate this setup a few times to add a few more layers of assets and scattering debris across our landscape. Okay, so now that I've finished up with the ground plane, let me show you all of the layers one by one. So of course we start with our leaves, and then we go to our ground cover, which is the green clover plants. And then I added some small sticks, the wooden sticks from Quixel Bridge, which you might not see everywhere. Like there's one right there, and they're kind of mixed in the ground. And then I've also added some mossy mounds, so some rocks and stuff like that. And you can see like things like that here. And what I've done here as well is on the transform points node, I've enabled recompute seed and then played around with the seed that I like. So again, if you're not happy with the scatter, you don't need to worry too much about changing this guy here, because that'll mess everything up. You can do it in your transform points node. And then lastly, I've added is these small weeds that isn't really noticeable, but in some close-ups you would see them. So like these guys right here kind of sticking up through the leaves, and this guy right here. Okay, so that's it for the ground plane, and now I'll just show you the extra details that I added to the scene. So now I'm back in my main scene, which is the same setup with just larger PCG volumes. Just a friendly like and subscribe reminder. This is that I downloaded from Dimensiva. And then the next thing I added were these broken tree stumps. So mossy tree stumps and these guys as well. And this was sort of to get some visual balance in the scene and almost act like a coffee table or something. So manually placed those and downloaded them from Quixel Bridge. I then manually place these forest roots and subtle mounds coming out of the leaves just here, just to kind of break up the base around the chair legs and to give this stump a bit more realism. So that's just these guys here if I toggle them on and off. I also added this oak branch and then wood sorrel models coming out of the tree stump. And then in the background, you can't really see, but I've added a few other broken tree stumps or chopped down trees just to kind of give an idea that the blank void space is where trees used to be and now it's empty. And if you're wondering what this guy is, this is just so I can hand paint some tree shadows. It's just a plane with a alpha mask on it. The next thing I did was paint on some foliage. So these guys right here, I just painted them on in the foliage mode like this, and then selected a few leaves and things like that and painted them on the chair and then also onto the tree stump itself. And then I also painted the same ground cover models kind of coming out of the tree stump just to give it a little more visual interest. Just so if you look at this view here, it kind of just feels like it belongs in the landscape a bit more. And as for the effects, I have some birds, some falling leaves, and some dust particles, and you can get the leaves and birds for free. One of the birds and leaves is from this Rural Australia pack, and then the other falling leaves effects is from the Electric Dreams environment. Both of these packs have really good falling leaves effects. The leaves move like as if there's wind, and they have a bit of curvature to them, so it looks a lot more realistic than just flat leaf planes. So you can just jump into those projects, right click, migrate them into your one, and then just drag them into your scene. And I'll just show you what that does for the scene. So if I just turn on all of the falling leaves and particles, it just looks so much better. You can see like the birds were in the background here. You have some leaves falling in front of us, and then the Rural Australia leaf pack also has, which I think is this guy here, also supports physics. So you can see it'll actually land onto the landscape floor and stay there and then slowly decay. So really cool. And the final effect were just these dust particles that I've turned on. You can see these little orange dots and you can kind of see them fade in and out, and it just adds a little more atmosphere to the scene. As for the lighting, I didn't really do any other changes. All I did was go to the exponential height fog, go into the details panel, and I just enabled volumetric fog. So without it and with it makes a big difference. I still really love the non-volumetric look, but just for the color palette and scene I had in mind, I just turned it on. There's definitely more work that can be done, especially around the tree stumps or like the horizon line, but I had so much fun making this scene and trying to get something looking photorealistic. So other than those couple things, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. I want to jump into the spline tools within PCG next, so that'll be really fun. So if you have any good resources, please link them below. I'm looking to learn. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. If I've forgotten anything or didn't mention something, let me know in the comments. I'll respond to you guys, and I'll see you next week. Peace. Oh, also like and subscribe if it was helpful, and sign up to my newsletter. See you guys.